Start. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us and ready to listen to Fred Rosenbaum's author, historian, educators talk about Jews and baseball.
Okay, thank you, Gabor. So I'm Fred Rosenbaum. I'm the scholar in residence for the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival. And tonight it's batter up. We turn to baseball. So, it's remarkable how a leisure activity like baseball helped transform American Jewish identity and everyday life, especially from the 1930s to the 1960s. These mid-century decades, which I'd like to focus on tonight, they were the most pivotal in our history, when the children and grandchildren of East European immigrants realized that proverbial American dream of acceptance and opportunity. The shift from the cities to the suburbs got underway at this time. Many Jews moved out of the Northeast to the South and the West in the mid-20th century. In 1930, we were only 125,000 in California, and by 1960, 600,000 Jews in our state. And during this period, Jews gained political power. In 1940, we had no senators and only 7 members of the House of Representatives, 4 of them from New York City. By the 1960s, although discrimination had hardly disappeared, we were much more accepted by non-Jews in universities and professional schools and corporate boardrooms and as political candidates. The Holocaust evoked the sympathy of the Gentiles, and the plucky new state of Israel was widely admired. In short, this was a 30-year period, a time span, arriving at what a prominent historian has called feeling at home in America. And our deep involvement in baseball not only reveals, but also affected how we confronted the momentous challenges of this era. Acculturating to America and yet remaining distinct. Reacting to rabid anti-Semitism. Supporting Black people in their quest for integration. Now, how could a sport, an amusement, after all, be of such consequence? Well, social historians have considered baseball, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, more than a mere game, but rather America's secular religion. It was that important. And sociologists, too, have seen the ballpark as kind of a temple, drawing people together from various, even antagonistic backgrounds and faiths into another space, a venerated space with its own ritual and rapture, its own legends and lore and terminology. Open to everyone, the national pastime put Jews in contact with a cross-section of their whole city. Gentiles of all kinds, including people of color who, they often did not encounter in the dense, homogeneous Jewish neighborhoods that time. It even eased tensions, at least for an afternoon, within ethnic groups. Jewish fans, from Orthodox to Reform to secular, rooted as one for the home team. Now, 2 generations ago, baseball dominated spectator sports. Pro basketball and football had nowhere near the allure that they have today. And the fervor was not limited to the majors. By the 1950s, there were almost 500 minor league clubs, such as the top-notch San Francisco Seals, which produced Joe DiMaggio. While baseball was segregated until 1947, and that's another way it reflected America, the Negro Leagues fielded dozens of teams and often drawing 10,000 or more fans to their games. In addition to high school and college competition, the Little League was established in 1939. Variations were played by those lacking a large field or proper equipment. Stickball, for example, was pervasive on the inner city streets. Just playing catch on a sidewalk could be a bonding experience between father and son. The game was woven into the seasonal rhythm of American life, inseparable from summer, of course, but also spring, ushered in by opening day, fall, heralded by the World Series, and winter, well, that's the Hot Stove League. And it's a post-mortem on the season past and predictions on the season to come. I remember as a child, even while it was snowing outside, long drawn-out debates about who was the best center fielder in New York, Mays, Mantle, or Snyder. These disputes were almost Talmudic in their intricacies. Back then, there was a sense of permanence that seemed to enshrine the game. Unlike our own day, as you all know, with new rules almost every season, the designated hitter, the pitch clock, the larger bases, the expanded playoff schedules, etc. The game as played on the field, after it was codified in 1903, the game remained unchanged for the next 50 years. And most of the ballparks were smaller then, allowing fans to be closer to the action and providing a more intimate experience. Ebbets Field had a capacity of only 32,000. Its successor in LA, Dodger Stadium, seats twice as many. The Brooklyn players usually lived near the ballpark and were greeted as they walked in the streets or used public transportation even to get to the game. Nor did their salaries, which averaged less than $20,000 a year, separate them all that much from the middle-class fans. Sandy Koufax, perhaps the greatest left-handed pitcher of all time, held out for $125,000 a year in 1966. Today, an ace like that would earn up to $40 to $50 million a season. Then many players took other jobs in the winter, even as the film shows the perennial all-star Al Rosen, who sold real estate. Now, the sport was a money-making enterprise then as now. But until the 1970s, it was easier for the fans to identify with a player as one of their own. Now, as we in the East Bay know all too well, franchises have moved locations frequently. That too was unheard of until the mid-1950s. There were simply two leagues with 8 teams each that never moved for half a century. When I was a child, I didn't even know that abandoning a city was possible until my beloved Dodgers departed for LA. leaving me stunned and devastated. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, who chose the Dodgers slogan, "Wait till next year," as the title of her memoir, she declared the club's exit an invidious betrayal. I couldn't speak with such incisive prose as a fifth grader, but I felt the same way. I didn't care that the Giants left too, because they were our hated rivals from across the river in Manhattan. The Yankees remained, but rooting for those conceited guys in wearing pinstripes that conjured up Wall Street, that would have carried the onus of me declaring I was a Republican. Let's look at the first slide. Now, this was Major League Baseball from 1903 to 1953. You see it's only in the northeast quadrant of the United States. It only moved outside this region in 1958, even though there was commercial air travel more than a dozen years before that. Now, this map shows the following. The cities in red each have one team. The cities in black, Boston, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Chicago, they each have two teams. In those days, Boston had two teams, not just the Red Sox, but also the Boston Braves. Philadelphia had, of course, the Phillies, but also the Philadelphia Athletics. St. Louis had the Cardinals and the St. Louis Browns. And of course, Chicago, as today, the White Sox and the Cubs. And of course, the New York area had three teams, and that's set off there in yellow. Now, while baseball was confined to the Northeast, this is where over 90% of American Jews lived in the middle of the century. Each of the 10 big league cities had significant Jewish populations. Chicago, Philadelphia, and Washington, about 300,000 Jews each. But none came close to New York, which in 1940 had 2 million Jews, almost half the entire country's Jewish population, just within the 5 boroughs. And its 3 teams, playing in the midst of the world's largest media market, accounted for most of the drama. In the 21 years between 1936 and 1956, New York clubs were in the World Series 16 times out of those 21 years. In 10 of those seasons, so almost half of those seasons, both teams in the Fall Classic were from the Big Apple. So what I'm saying in short is that Major League Baseball was centered where the Jews were centered. Okay, we can remove that. Thank you. Now, we were part of the game as no other group, producing numerous players, as the film emphasizes, but also press agents and promoters and radio and TV broadcasters and statisticians and sports writers and club owners. That's a trend that has continued. You know, in the 1989 Bay Bridge World Series, Both teams were owned by Jews. Bob Lurie of the Giants and Wally Haas of the A's. The founder and longtime head of the Players Union was Jewish, as was the controversial commissioner of baseball for 2 decades, Bud Selig. As the movie shows, a superstar in women's pro baseball was Jewish. Even the song Take Me Out to the Ball Game was written by a Jew. Now, the film covers this with excellent footage. But I'm struck by the Jewish infatuation with baseball in other areas. Jews choosing it as a subject for in-depth inquiry and as a theme for cultural creativity. Its best histories have been written by Jews. Roger Kahn's Boys of Summer, capturing the exuberance of the Brooklyn Dodgers, is the most best known of all. The preeminent journalist David Halberstam wrote 2 classics, Summer of '49 and October 1964. Peter Levine's book has the apt title From Ellis Island to Ebbets Field. Even the path-breaking work on baseball's greatest scandal, the Chicago White Sox throwing the World Series in 1919, even that book was written by 2 Jews who conclude that the Jewish gambler and gangster Arnold Rothstein was behind it. Now, these are popular works, but the sport has also become the topic of scholarly books and dozens of articles in academic journals. University courses on baseball and American society are now taught across the country, invariably by Jewish professors, including at San Francisco State since the 1990s. Most of the baseball movies have been directed or written by Jews. Think of them: Field of Dreams, Bad News Bears, The Natural, Bang the Drum Slowly, Moneyball, all of those. But to me, most telling are the novels, which show the deep impact baseball has had on the Jewish literary imagination. Let's take a look at the next slide. Now, 3 of these are by the giants of American literature. The first 3, reading from left to right, Malamud, Roth, and Potok. And note, they all came of age from the 1930s to the 1960s, the period I'm focusing on, and in the New York area. I even put what part of the New York area underneath their names. Now, The Natural, Malamud's first book, features the courageous comeback of a spectacular player from the Midwest. He's played by Robert Redford in the movie, who had been shot by a woman on a train just when he was showing the most promise. Now, there are no Jewish characters in The Natural, but the literary critics suggest that Malamud, who was raised by immigrants from Tsarist Russia, chose baseball for the setting of his novel to prove his American bona fides at the outset, before setting out on a career of fiction that would be steeped in Jewish content. In other words, it's like he was saying, I'm not just a brainy writer from Brooklyn, but I also know the heartland. Philip Roth's novel reveals an extraordinary knowledge of the game, every nuance on and off the field throughout this entire book. He invents a hapless team that during the war loses its stadium and is always wandering in exile, so to speak, ever the visitor in someone else's home park. What does that sound like? Through the misfortunes of this club of oddballs, he mercilessly satirizes the ugliest side of American life in the 1940s. The racism that they have to endure, anti-Semitism. He brings in hero worship and greed and even anti-communist hysteria. Now, Chaim Potak's two main characters are religious teenage Jews who meet on the ball field. One pitches for his modern Orthodox team. The other plays for his Hasidic team and hits a line drive right back at the pitcher, seriously injuring him. But this accident brings the two together, first by a hospital visit and then through philosophical discussions resulting in their close friendship and life-changing decisions. Now, the one on the right, The Celebrant, that's by the lesser-known Eric Greenberg. Yet it ranks as among the greatest baseball novels. The son of Jewish immigrants aspires to play pro ball despite his religious parents' objections. This is a familiar trope in Jewish baseball literature. The Orthodox parents don't think that baseball is for a Jewish boy. But the main thing is the kid's obsession with the phenomenal New York Giants pitcher, Christy Mathewson, who is an evangelical Christian who refuses to pitch on Sundays. The Jewish youth watches his heroes every game on a bluff overlooking the Polo Grounds, and even follows this handsome, blonde epitome of a wasp to other cities when the Giants go on the road, leaving behind his family, his education, his heritage. Baseball surpasses everything. Okay, we can remove that. Now, what these novelists, historians, filmmakers all have in common is an intense Jewish passion for the game. How can we explain that? Some say baseball, which is not a contest of brute force, comports well with the Jewish spirit. Now, Jews also excelled in boxing in this period, but that grew out of the need for self-defense, to fight kids of other ethnic groups on the mean city streets. Much more popular was baseball, requiring not only speed and agility, strategy, patience, but also teamwork. Some have gone further, like Rabbi Paley, shown in the film, who wrote that baseball is a gift from God that puts Jews in touch with eternity, olam. He says there's no clock in baseball, so it's timeless. There's no spatial limit, as the outfield can go on forever, theoretically. But I think he's getting too rhapsodic here. The generation I'm focusing on, baseball was primarily a pathway to Americanization. Created in pastoral surroundings when the country was young, was passed down largely unchanged, as I said, as a national legacy. Let's look at the next slide. To me, this is best expressed by Philip Roth And on the left, you see Roth as a child. He's second from the left. That's his big brother, the artist Sander Roth, on in the right. And on the far right here is Roth around the time he wrote these lines. Now, I think he has really captured this point I'm trying to make. First, he writes about his parents. Now, his parents were both born in the United States of immigrants. He writes, "My parents were influenced by what often seemed antiquated, socially useless, old country mores and perceptions. My boyhood society cohered around the most inherently American phenomenon. Baseball, whose mystique you could always have it your side, your room." Let's see here a second. "Not only while you did your homework, but in bed when you slept, with a ball, a bat, and a glove. The solace that my Orthodox grandfather took from the leathery odor of the flesh-worn straps of the old tefillin, which he wrapped himself each morning, I derived from the smell of my mitt, which I ritually donned every day to work on my pocket." That last paragraph, I think, is especially strong. That's so Rothian, comparing his grandfather's tefillin to his baseball mitt. And I think there you have that generational issue and that Americanization so vividly expressed. Okay, we can remove that. By the way, Roth also wrote that his all-consuming love for baseball would be eclipsed only by literature. And he linked the dramatic, suspenseful nature of both baseball and, of course, his life's preoccupation of literature. Now, Jews were also drawn to the game by their superstars, hailed throughout the nation, whom they could claim as their own. Hank Greenberg from the Bronx. He really longed to play for the Yankees, but they offered him a contract, but they already had a first baseman, Lou Gehrig. So he decided instead to sign with the Detroit Tigers. And Detroit was no backwater then. It was the fourth most populous city in the country in the 1930s, larger than LA. And it had a vibrant Jewish community of 70,000. As the documentary shows, it was also the epicenter of American anti-Semitism. Given the hatred spewed by Henry Ford's newspaper, Father Charles Coughlin's vitriolic radio broadcast. I would add to the film the smear spread throughout the nation by Charles A. Lindbergh, the most popular person in the country, who claimed that Jews were pushing America into the war. So Hank Greenberg's heroics could not have been more welcome at this time, when Jews yearned to be accepted during the most anti-Semitic period in American history. They needed a hero. Greenberg was that hero. I think it's instructive to compare Greenberg with another superstar of the same era, the graceful center fielder Joe DiMaggio of the Italian community. Like the Jews, they suffered deprivation and oppression in Europe. before immigrating here at the turn of the century in large numbers. They too, they were not considered white at first and were demeaned, although with a different set of stereotypes than the Jews. They were denigrated as uneducated and violent, and of course as mafiosos. They faced added pressure after Mussolini joined the Axis during World War II. You know, the dual loyalties charge. So they needed a sports hero just as much as the Jews did. Let's look at the next slide. These two players, DiMaggio and Greenberg, were the two best players in this period. And they led their clubs to multiple World Series championships. And for a decade, beginning in 1935, no American League team other than the Yankees or the Tigers went to the Fall Classic. So only those two teams won the American League pennant for a decade, largely because of these two superstars. Now, I have some statistics here. Please indulge me in this. I have that Jewish passion for baseball statistics myself. So you can see how comparable they are. They played just around the same period. DiMaggio played more seasons because Greenberg missed more due to military service. I'm going to come to that in a moment. I would say at the outset that DiMaggio was the better fielder by far. Greenberg did not excel in the field. But I do believe that Greenberg was the better hitter, especially more of a power hitter. Now look at the career averages. It's true, DiMaggio has a higher batting average. By the way, both of these averages, 325 and 315, they are exceptionally high. Today, out of about 850 players, only 3 or 4 have career averages over 300. But Greenberg hit for more power. He has a higher slugging percentage. What is that? Well, you know, the batting average is the hits. Singles, doubles, triples, they all home runs, they all count as the same. But slugging is total bases. So a double counts for 2, a triple counts for 3. And Greenberg has a higher slugging percentage. What is OPS? That's on base percentage plus slugging. On base is not just hits, but if you get on due to a walk or hit by pitch. And Greenberg has DiMaggio beat on that. By the way, these are very high figures, especially Greenberg's over 1.0. Today, only 2 players in the major leagues are around that, and that would be Shohei Ohtani and Aaron Judge, just those 2. To have an OPS over 1 is exceptional. Now, the last statistic is one I invented myself. Home runs per season. I counted only full seasons. And you see that Greenberg has more home runs per season than DiMaggio. The nation was fixated as each slugger chased hallowed records. Greenberg came close to matching Babe Ruth's 60 homers in one season. And the Yankee Clipper set a new record for the longest hitting streak, an astounding 56 consecutive games, which he got at least one hit. That is a mark that still stands. Now, both instilled pride in their people, right? The Italians and the Jews. but Greenberg's impact was greater, in part because they two behave differently off the field. Let's scroll to the next, scroll down, please. Greenberg had already completed his military service in peacetime, but after Pearl Harbor was the first major leaguer to enlist, and he missed 4.5 seasons at the peak of his career. More time in uniform than any other player. By the way, these pictures were, in the newspapers about his military service, right? Just right in the middle of his baseball career and lasting so long. He commanded a fleet of B-29 bombers based in China that made runs over Japan. Let's look at the, scroll down again, please. DiMaggio, on the other hand, stayed home and played the entire 1942 season with the Yankees. Because the fans booed him as a draft dodger, even at Yankee Stadium, he finally enlisted in 1943, 14 months after we entered the war. He never went overseas, and he was based in Hawaii as a hitting instructor for the Army's baseball teams. Also, Joltin' Joe's personal life was tumultuous. He married Marilyn Monroe, which certainly raised his stature. But their union lasted only 9 months because of his uncontrolled jealousy and domestic violence. Okay, can remove that. The most important difference, though, was how each star projected his ethnicity. Their family's roots in the old country could not have run deeper. Greenberg's parents were Orthodox Romanian immigrants who raised him in the New York tenements. DiMaggio came from a large family of Sicilian fishermen who had settled in San Francisco's North Beach. Now, in these tense decades, when most Jews in the entertainment industry changed their names and downplayed their Jewishness, Greenberg did the reverse. As a youth, he turned away from the traditional Judaism of his parents, but as a celebrity, he publicly embraced his Jewish identity, largely as a reaction to Hitler. He reveled in nicknames like the Hebrew Hammer, and sometimes confronted and intimidated Jew-hating bench jockeys on the opposing team. It helped that he was 6'4" and thickly muscled and held a bat in his hand. The film did not mention that once he got into a physical altercation after an obscene slur by a Cardinal pitcher, whom he beat badly before other players broke it up. As we all know, he did not play on Yom Kippur against the Yankees. Like my boyhood idol, Sandy Koufax, 30 years later during the World Series. Now, this sent another important message to American Jewry at this difficult time. Acculturate to the host society, yes, but draw a limit to assimilation, such that you retain at least some of your distinctive heritage. DiMaggio, by contrast, conveyed very little of his Italian ancestry, and he welcomed his teammates calling him by the nickname Dago. that would have offended most others. Nor did his athletic prowess contradict prejudice the way Greenberg did. The Italians, for all the insults hurled at them, were not accused, as the Jews were, of being weak, overly bookish, and cowardly. This was defamation that Greenberg's actions emphatically contradicted. A ball player, he was nevertheless the most important American Jew in the 1930s, even if Einstein was more consequential to the world as a whole. Alan Dershowitz said that as a child, he thought Greenberg could be the first Jewish president. Now, in 1947, Greenberg's last season, Branch Rickey, general manager and co-owner of the Dodgers, broke the color barrier by bringing Jackie Robinson to Brooklyn. The other 15 club owners opposed integration, but the high-minded Rickey went ahead. It was a bold move. As hard as it is to comprehend today, even basketball was segregated at this time. The NBA would not have an African-American player until 1950. The Yankees would not sign a black player until 1955. The Boston Red Sox not until 1959. Now, the breakthrough really had to be in Brooklyn, one of the most liberal parts of the country and the most Jewish, with 900,000 Jews at the time, almost half the borough. And they were overwhelmingly progressive, over 90% having voted for FDR. By contrast, some of the other major league cities at the time, like Washington and St. Louis, were still legally segregated. It was sometimes hard to get a hotel for Robinson there, even more so during spring training down in Florida. In fact, the first spring training in 47, Branch Rickey didn't even use the Dodger facility in Florida because he thought it was too dangerous. The Dodgers did spring training in Havana, Cuba. One bitter quip was that Robinson leads the league in everything but hotel reservations. Let's look at the next slide. Robinson led his team to 6 pennants and 1 World Series victory. But it was his electrifying style of play that thrilled Jews and everyone else. The way his cap flew off as he ran the bases. The way he danced off first, unnerving the pitcher. The way he slid, just grazing the corner of the bag. He was also a terrific fielder. The one on the lower left shows him making a double play. But above all, he was just a terror to the opposing team on the bases. Now, stealing home is the game's most daring play. Robinson did it 19 times, including once in the World Series, which you see here in the upper left. That's Yogi Berra as the catcher. And Yogi claimed he had Robinson out. The umpire called Robinson safe, and Yogi just jumped up and down and in fury, was almost thrown out of the game. The rest of his life, Berra would always say he was out, but this was really one of the most iconic plays in baseball history. But Robinson stole home, as I say, 19 times. Rickey Henderson, the greatest base stealer of all time, stole home only 4 times in his long career. Okay, we can remove that. As Rebecca Alpert rightly puts it in the film, Jews identified with this sensational athlete so closely, they almost considered him Jewish. His people's struggle for freedom echoed Judaism's central belief of liberation from bondage in Egypt. And immigrant Jewish families in particular, having experienced discrimination in the interwar period, often empathized with Blacks who were migrants themselves, because they recently arrived in northern cities from the South in large numbers. And well before Robinson, influential Jewish newspaper columnists like Walter Winchell, also a radio personality, called for integrating professional sports. They were affected by the patriotism and bravery shown by Blacks in the US Armed Forces during the war. Now, during his playing career and afterwards, Robinson returned the goodwill, using his prestige to fight all bigotry alongside the ADL and the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And he publicly condemned the anti-Semitism of Black nationalists. Let's look at the next slide. There were so many Jewish friends and neighbors around the Robinsons' home in Brooklyn that his young son actually thought the family was Jewish. In the photo on the upper left, that chubby kid on the right, Robinson has his arm around him. He's the son of a Jewish civil rights attorney and was a fan with whom Robinson formed a lifelong friendship, exchanging 20 letters. This push by Jews to integrate baseball can be seen as an early chapter, even as a springboard in the Black-Jewish alliance. Now look at the impact Robinson made on 11-year-old Alan Dershowitz and how the Harvard law professor puts it in the context of civil rights struggle over the next decade and a half. Dershowitz writes, "The most formative event of all our young lives was Jackie Robinson coming to the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. Dershowitz was a kid growing up in Brooklyn, although he went to a yeshiva in Manhattan. He writes, "I don't think the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would have been passed that soon if he hadn't come to the major leagues." That's a very big statement by a professor of constitutional law. He was such a commendable person and a man of character that he made integration safe. Okay, we can remove that. In recent decades, though, scholars have pointed to a mutually suspicious, even contentious Black-Jewish relationship, even as both groups fought for social justice. This conflicted friendship can be seen in the Negro Leagues, which operated when the sport was segregated. And when 4 Jews, 3 of them Yiddish-speaking immigrants, owned many of the leading Black teams. Let's look at the next slide. One of these Jewish owners of Black teams was Abe Saperstein. Now, he's better known as the founder and owner and first coach of the Harlem Globetrotters, the black basketball team, known for its comedic antics as well as its athletic ability. At 5'3", Abe was a little out of place on the court. He also owned, as I've said, 3 black baseball teams, some of whose players, like Satchel Paige, who is shown here in the upper left, he's the figure on the right. Satchel Paige would have been a superstar in the majors. But the Negro League games drew few white fans, and their African-American owners ran into discrimination in lending. And they often faced bankruptcy. Saperstein and several other well-financed Jewish businessmen bought up many of the best Negro clubs for rock-bottom prices. One of them featured Hank Aaron, and they used their resources and skills to make them profitable. By the Depression, almost every white owner of a Negro League team was Jewish. This reminds me of the Jewish relationship with black musicians during the birth of the blues. Jews were rarely performers, but very often the promoters and agents doing well for themselves and their clients. Jewish owners had the connections, which few black entrepreneurs did, to lease 6 major league ballparks, even Yankee Stadium, for the Negro League games while the Yanks were on the road. Saperstein cleared the gambling debts of some of his players and paid for their family members' funerals. Now, for all he did bolstering black baseball and all the affection he showed certain players, Saperstein and other Jewish owners were sometimes attacked by black sports writers as paternalistic and worse, as rapacious Shylocks exploiting African-American athletes to line their pockets. Much of this was unfair, but it is true that they paid the players paltry wages while taking lofty salaries and commissions themselves. The only white owner of a Negro team who was not Jewish, not strong, was assumed to be because of his sharp business practices. Even though a Protestant, he was known as the Hebrew Menace. Now let's go back to slide 7, Gabor, and let's scroll down. That's it. In the 1930s, several Jewish owners created a Negro team called the Ethiopian Clowns, who wore grass skirts and wigs and painted themselves with whiteface, which you see here in their promotional poster. And this cast doubt on the seriousness of Negro baseball as a whole. And this was sharply criticized in the black press that they did this, kind of like minstrelly, but even more offensive. And look, the team that they're playing is called the original Borneo Cannibal Giants. You see in the lower right, that's a book by Rebecca Alpert, who is featured in the film. She left the rabbinate and went into academics, and she got tenure as a professor based on this book on the Jews and Negro baseball. She explores for the first time this Black-Jewish encounter in the Negro Leagues and shows the importance of this chapter. Ken, remove that. When Branch Rickey planned to sign Robinson, Saperstein stood in the way of integration because it would mean the collapse of the Negro Leagues, which had made him sizable profits. Black fans would prefer to see their stars in the majors, of course. And even if the Negro Leagues continued, they would be bereft of their leading players. He and other Jewish owners desperately offered alternatives. They proposed to form two top all-Black teams, one added to the National League and one to the American League. Of course, this would only perpetuate segregation, as would another ill-conceived plan that they pushed, that the major leagues add an entire 8-team Negro League, with the winner playing the winner of the World Series for the national championship. Well, all of this was, of course, rejected. But when integration arrived, Saperstein adapted to it. He scouted African-American players for the Cleveland Indians, whose general manager was none other than Hank Greenberg, who would soon own the team. In 1948, they signed the second Black player in the majors, the future Hall of Famer Larry Doby. If Branch Rickey integrated the National League, Saperstein and Greenberg integrated the American League. Next, they recruited the incomparable Satchel Paige, but he had spent his best years in the Negro Leagues, and he was now 42, past his prime. Still, he would pitch in the majors until he was close to 50. The different roles Saperstein played in Black baseball: support, but also self-interest, which elicited both appreciation and vilification. They reveal some of the complexity of Black-Jewish relations at mid-century. Now, let me conclude by saying that over the past generation, the Jewish ardor for the game has cooled somewhat. Of course, many of us are still thrilled by a towering home run, aggressive base runner, impossible catch by a fielder. But we're long past needing the game to make us feel like we belong here. And while once again we face a surge of anti-Semitism, as we did in the 1930s, today's prejudice and ignorance flow from toxic sources different from those in the interwar period. And they cannot be countered by the attainments of Major League ball players. Not that we even have a superstar like Greenberg or Koufax. The closest we've come recently is the slugger Ryan Braun of the Milwaukee Brewers, mentioned in the film, who hit over 300 home runs and was most valuable player in 2011. But he was later suspended for half a season after testing positive for performance-enhancing drugs. For a second time, he stooped even lower by claiming without evidence that he was the victim of anti-Semites out to get him, before finally admitting that he had indeed injected himself with testosterone, high levels of testosterone. Hardly the role model of Jewish heroes. And no longer do we identify with the athletic achievements of ball players of oppressed minorities like Jackie Robinson, as we did in the civil rights era. Today, around 40% of major leaguers are men of color. So the subtitle of the movie, An American Love Story, is really something of the past. Rather, Jews and baseball are just good friends now. But let's remember how the grand old game eased our path, becoming accepted during the most vulnerable period in our history, lifting us up in the eyes of others, even changing the way we saw ourselves. Thank you. Okay, maybe we could have some questions now.